For more than 100 centuries, the Emperor has sat immobile on the golden throne of earth. He is the master of mankind. By the might of his inexhaustible armies, 1,000,000 worlds stand against the dark. Yet he is a rotting carcass, the carrion lord of the Imperium, held in life by marvels from the dark age of technology, and the 1,000 souls sacrificed each day, so his may continue to burn. To be a man in such times is to be one amongst untold billions. It is to live in the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. It is to suffer an eternity of carnage and slaughter. It is to have cries of anguish and sorrow drowned by the thirsting laughter of dark gods. This is a dark and terrible era where you will find little comfort or hope. Forget the power of technology and science. Forget the promise of progress and advancement. Forget any notion of common humanity or compassion. There is no peace amongst the stars, for in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The universe of Warhammer 40,000 is one of a dystopian nightmare. It is a universe in which humanity stands fighting against the dark, against horrific aliens and the forces of the Immaterium known as Chaos. It is a universe of untold horrors and unspeakable evils lurking in the darks of space, waiting to consume all of humanity. The only hope against these evils is the Imperium of Man, led by the might of the Adeptus Astartes, also commonly known as Space Marines, super soldiers engineered by the Emperor of Mankind 10,000 years before, as well as the defiant and resilient forces of the Astra Militarum and the agents of the Imperium who work in the shadows of mankind, the Inquisition. Together, these forces mark humanity's last defense against the extinction of their species. And behind them, on the golden throne, the Emperor of Mankind sits, his body destroyed, his soul trapped in an eternal struggle against the forces that lie beyond the material world, where 1,000 psychers are sacrificed each day so that he may live. Hello and welcome to my channel. If you are new to the Warhammer 40,000 universe, welcome. Chances are you may have discovered Warhammer from some other form of media, perhaps a video game or a comic, and want to learn more about this fascinating universe and the rich lore behind it. My hope is that this video will serve as an introduction to the Warhammer universe for newcomers. The lore of the Warhammer universe is deep. There have been hundreds of novels written and published by Black Library, as well as over 40 decades of lore in the published game books by Games Workshop. As such, there is no way to encapsulate that entirely in a 20-minute video. However, I will attempt to condense the main themes to serve as a launching spot. So where do we begin? The best place to begin is with the Emperor of Mankind, as he sits front and center at the heart of the Warhammer universe. Not much is known of the origins of the Emperor of Mankind, and although many speculate on who he is and where he came from, we have only ever been given hints about his beginnings. What we do know about him is that he was a powerful warrior, a leader of men, and a potent psyker wielding unimaginable power. Many speculate that he has lived for thousands of years, at times working behind the scenes in humanity's history. And while the history of mankind in this universe could take hours to explain, I will focus primarily on the point of time where the Emperor made himself manifest to humanity in his current form. This happened some 10,000 years or so before the current timeline in the lore, during a period of humanity's history known as the Unification Wars. During this time, Earth, also known more commonly in the Warhammer universe as Terra, was little more than a post-apocalyptic hellscape. Wars had ravaged the planet, and ran humanity to near extinction and barbarism. During this era, various regions of the world were governed by what would be known as techno-barbarian lords. It was during this time that the Emperor of Mankind, with the assistance of his faithful servants, created the first ideation of the Space Marine, known then as the Thunder Warriors. These genetically altered humans were crafted by the Emperor of Mankind with one purpose: to unite the planet of Terra under his banner, and to return humanity to the prominence it once held in the galaxy. The Emperor of Mankind was successful in this endeavor, and ultimately, one by one, he conquered each of the techno-barbarian lords, uniting Earth under his new Imperium of Man. It was also during this time that the Emperor created what would become known as the Primarchs, powerful super soldiers crafted to lead his newly created Space Marines across the galaxy, to unite other planets of mankind under his banner. This endeavor would become known as the Great Crusade. However, lurking in the darkness of the Immaterium were the gods of chaos, primordial entities who saw the Emperor of Mankind as a threat. These gods sought the extinction of mankind and truly had been working for millennia to undo humanity entirely. These gods managed to scatter the Primarchs, still infants, across the stars in hopes to later convert them to chaos, and to prevent the Emperor of Mankind from uniting humanity under the Imperium of Man. The Emperor continued creating his Space Marines, legions of genetically altered super soldiers, forged to empower the Imperium in the coming crusade to unite humanity. For the Emperor, among his many gifts, had the ability of foresight, and knew the horrors of the universe beyond Terra that stood between him and the unification of the Imperium beyond the stars. And so the Emperor set to the stars to find his lost sons, the Primarchs. One by one he located them on distant worlds. Most of the Primarchs had risen to vast levels of power on their respective worlds, and when the Emperor of Mankind discovered them, they bent the knee to serve his vision for the Imperium, albeit some did so more begrudgingly than others, but that is a story for another time. With his sons found and returned to their respective Space Marine legions, the Emperor continued on with the Great Crusade, discovering backwater worlds of humanity lost since the Age of Strife, a period where mankind fell into darkness and the planets were cut off from Terra and each other. One by one, his forces of Space Marines came to these worlds with one of two choices: join the Imperium and accept the Imperial truth, or face annihilation. For those that joined, they were adopted into the Imperium, but not all of these worlds were so complicit, many of which rebuked the Emperor and his vision. These worlds were met with the full military might of the Space Marines, or in many cases, merely eradicated entirely, their worlds repopulated. It was during this time that the Emperor took a step back personally from leading the Great Crusade from the front. He named his first son, Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the Luna Wolves Space Marine Legion, as the War Master, with instructions to continue to lead the effort of the Great Crusade. The other Primarchs and their legions would follow Horus, as he held the authority of the Emperor in the endeavor of the Crusade. Now this was an important time in the history of humanity, as the Emperor returned to Terra to begin work on what would later be known as the Webway Project. Now I won't get too deep into this video, other than to say that during this time, and subsequently continuing on into the current timeline, that mankind's method of traversing great expanses in the vastness of space came in the form of warp travel. That is to say, ships would enter into the Immaterium and via psychic navigators would traverse the dangers of the warp to get from one point to another. This was often unpredictable and a dangerous means of travel, as the evil horrors of the immaterial dwell in the warp fueled by their dark masters, the gods of chaos. The Emperor had discovered a method by which to traverse the stars via the Webway, a much safer method of traveling in space. So he returned to Terra to pursue this endeavor. Now, before continuing on, I want to touch on something I mentioned earlier, the Imperial Truth. This was an edict set forth by the Emperor, which the Space Marines enacted when bringing a world into compliance. and it was at the heart of the vision of the Imperium of mankind. That is, the denouncing the notion of religion, faith in otherworldly powers, and superstition, and the acceptance of logic, technology, and science. The Emperor denounced the idea of gods, despite knowing there were, in fact, primordial entities that defied understanding of mankind who were fueled by their worship. These entities, known as the Chaos Gods, were in fact very real, and although one may argue it was well intentioned, the imperial truth was in essence a complete and total lie, fabricated by the Emperor to weaken the gods of chaos, of which he knew relied on worship to sustain themselves. Now, moving back to the Great Crusade, now being led by Horus Lupercal, who is generally regarded by his fellow Primarchs as one of, if not the greatest of them all. There were some who were jealous and envious of Horus's choosing as War Master. However, they all acquiesced to the will of their father, the Emperor, and the Great Crusade continued for a time. Now, without going into vast detail here, the Imperium of Man would face arguably its darkest period of history, as the gods of chaos managed, through nefarious means, to corrupt Horus. Horus turned against his father, now empowered by the forces of chaos, and thus began the Great Civil War, known as the Horus Heresy. The Horus Heresy is a defining era in the Warhammer universe. While the Civil War between the Space Marines only lasted about 7 standard years, its effects are still felt 10,000 years later in the current timeline. During the Heresy, half of the Primarchs, and subsequently their Space Marine legions, joined Horus and turned traitor against the Imperium of Man and the Emperor. Some were seduced themselves by the Chaos Gods, while others willingly turned their back on the Emperor as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Of the original 18 Space Marine legions, 9 of them joined Horus and turned against the Imperium. These were the Luna Wolves, also known as the Sons of Horus, the Death Guard, Night Lords, Emperor's Children, World Eaters, Thousand Sons, Alpha Legion, Iron Warriors, and the Word Bearers. Those legions that remained loyal to the Emperor included the Ultramarines, Dark Angels, Space Wolves, Blood Angels, Raven Guard, Salamanders, White Scars, Iron Hands, and the Imperial Fists. The actual size of these legions is a matter of debate, but it is generally accepted that each legion encompassed roughly 10,000 Space Marines. Some may have been even larger, however. These demigods waged war across the worlds of the Imperium, established in the Great Crusade, leaving many as nothing but lifeless husks in their wake. Horus and his traitor brothers would eventually make their way to Terra, with the goal of destroying the Emperor and remaking the Imperium of Man in the vision of Horus. Eventually, the traitors would make their way to the Imperium's homeworld and attack it in a series of battles that have been termed the Siege of Terra. Now, there are well over 50 books which detail the events of the Heresy, and even a separate series of books documenting the siege itself. Countless hours could be devoted to the storyline of the Heresy and the siege, and it is generally regarded as a landmark event of the Warhammer universe. After battles that raged across Terra, razing the planet to the ground, the Emperor would finally meet Horus on his battleship, orbiting Terra, the Vengeful Spirit. While the forces of the Space Marines and their traitor brothers waged war across the planet, father and son would finally face off against one another. And while Horus held within him the powers of the Chaos Gods combined, he eventually fell to the Emperor, who destroyed him entirely. But it was not without sacrifice. As Horus had slain his brother, the Primarch Sanguinius of the Blood Angels, moments before their battle, and the Emperor himself sustained a mortal wound at the hands of the arch-traitor. The death of Horus marked victory for the Imperium of Man as the now leaderless bands of traitor Space Marines fled Terra, breaking off into war bands and fleeing into the Immaterium via the Eye of Terror. The Imperium of Man was left with a destroyed homeworld and the Emperor clinging to life within a broken body. The Emperor of mankind was enshrined on the golden throne, the device he had left his sons in war to pursue designing, and his psychic energy, even 10,000 years later, guards and protects the Imperium from annihilation from the dark forces of chaos. It was after the events of the heresy that the Primarch of the Ultramarines, Rabute Guilliman, would adopt the Codex Astartes. That is, a guide and series of instructions which would now define how Space Marine chapters would be constructed and how they would wage war. Guilliman saw the folly of the legions and their size and sought to reduce the size of those legions into smaller chapters to prevent the destruction that a full legion of Space Marines could bring to bear should this ever happen again. This moment was also referred to as the Second Founding. Those loyalist Space Marine legions that remained were broken up into different chapters, numbering no more than 1,000 Space Marines each with their own chapter master and organizational structure. After the events of the heresy, some of the Primarchs had been slain, or in the case of the traitors, some had ascended to immortality, turned into hulking demon princes forever tied to the Immaterium. Some of the loyalist Primarchs died as well, notably Sanguinius, as mentioned earlier, as well as others such as Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands. Over time, those that remained would continue on for a short time leading their chapters, but all would eventually fade into obscurity or history. Over the 10,000 years that would follow the events of the heresy, the Imperium would transform from the vision of the imperial truth to one of totalitarian religious fanaticism and zealotry devoted to the Emperor. The forces of the Imperium would face many enemies across the expanse of space, to include the invasive Tyranids, nightmarish bug-like aliens who consume entire systems and absorb all living organisms, as well as the savagery and unpredictable nature of the Orcs, and many other alien races bent on attacking and destroying the Imperium and its inhabitants. Further, although thwarted by the Emperor during the heresy, the forces of chaos would continue to plague the Imperium of Man, with cults devoted to their dark gods, resulting in demonic manifestations, to the various Black Crusades launched from the Eye of Terror by the traitor and former sons of Horus Captain Abaddon, now leader of the Black Legion Chaos Space Marines. It was then in the 41st millennium of man that Abaddon, along with the forces of the Black Legion, launched his 13th Black Crusade against the Imperium of Man, this time crashing against the world of Cadia. It was during this crusade that the Imperium would be broken asunder by an event that Imperial remembrancers record as the Cicatrix Maledictum, or more commonly known as the Great Rift, a galaxy-spanning warp storm that split the Imperium in half. The two sides of the galaxy, now cut off from one another, faced the ever-increasing numbers of Chaos Space Marines and demons bursting through the Immaterium to launch assaults on the Imperium of Man. But not all hope is lost, for the Primarchs Rabute Guilliman and Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels have returned in the Imperium's darkest hour to thwart the forces of chaos, ushering in the Era Indomitus. To live in these times is to live in a nightmarish age, one where horrors lurk around every corner, and the day-to-day life of an Imperial citizen is one of suffering and toil to fuel the industrial military complex. For in the galaxy there can be no respite, there can be no reprieve, for there is only war. I hope you've enjoyed this video. The story of the Warhammer universe is vast and encompasses thousands of pages of text. This is merely the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the depth of this fascinating universe, but I hope it has served as a proper introduction to the setting. I hope you'll continue to follow me on this journey as we explore the depths of the Warhammer universe together in future videos. If you enjoyed this video, I do hope you'll take the opportunity to like and subscribe to the channel. Perhaps even drop a comment below telling me your favorite part of the Warhammer universe. Until next time, for the Emperor.